For 30 straight years, a proud member of NATO and the European Union had to beg a hostile foreign government for permission just to move its own ships. And the strange part is that these were never warships or military convoys carrying anything remotely dangerous. These were ordinary cargo boats trying to sail from one Polish port to another Polish port. And yet somehow they were forced to ask Russia for a written yes before they could cross their own coastline. Take a moment to really sit with how humiliating that situation actually was for a country like Poland. Here was a sovereign nation, fully integrated into the most powerful military alliance the world has ever seen, and it still could not guarantee that its own boats would reach open water without Russia's stamp of approval sitting somewhere on a piece of paper first. And Russia knew exactly what that leverage was worth. According to reporting on the region's history, there was an entire multi-year stretch where Russia simply shut that route down completely, no warning required, no court able to overturn it, no treaty forcing Moscow to explain itself at all. Then, on one single day in 2022, Poland made that entire arrangement permanently irrelevant. And the date Poland chose to do it wasn't random at all. It landed on the exact 83rd anniversary of the day Soviet tanks first rolled across the Polish border, according to UPI's coverage of the event. Poland picked the anniversary of its own invasion to tell Russia the leverage was over for good. To understand exactly how much real power Russia had held over this one narrow stretch of water for 30 long years, and to understand why Poland finally decided it had endured enough, you first need to look closely at the map itself. Because this entire story begins with a single narrow gap of sand sitting on precisely the wrong side of the border. Picture a thin, natural wall of sand and pine trees stretching for roughly 90 kilometers along Poland's Baltic coastline, functioning almost like a long breakwater standing guard against the open sea. On one side of that wall sits the open Baltic Sea itself, wide and unobstructed. On the other side sits something called the Vistula Lagoon, a large, calm, enclosed body of water stretching roughly 56 kilometers, with the historic Polish trading city of Elbląg sitting quietly at its southern end. That thin wall of sand is known as the Vistula Spit, and there is one single detail about it that explains 3 entire decades of tension, in a way that becomes obvious the moment you actually see it. That long wall of sand has exactly one natural gap running through it, a single break where the lagoon actually connects to the open sea. And that gap does not sit conveniently near the Polish side of the coastline at all. It sits at the very far northern end, deep inside Russian-controlled territory, in a place called the Strait of Baltic. One narrow gap, sitting at exactly the wrong end of the coastline, and for 30 years Russia held the only real key to it. According to historical records on the region, this wasn't some ancient arrangement carved in stone by treaty. It happened because of where a line got drawn on a map back in 1945. The Vistula Spit belonged to German East Prussia until the end of the Second World War. When the post-war borders were redrawn, the southern section went to Poland, but the northern tip, including that one natural strait, got absorbed into what eventually became the Soviet territory of Kaliningrad. Poland inherited a massive lagoon with only one way out to open sea, and that one exit sat behind a door Moscow controlled completely. Now here's exactly how Russia used that door for 30 straight years. According to Polish government and parliamentary documentation, every single Polish ship wanting to leave that lagoon had to submit a formal transit request 14 days in advance for every individual vessel every single time. Russian authorities could approve it, delay it, or simply deny it for any reason or for absolutely no reason at all. And Russia didn't hesitate to use that power. According to Polish parliamentary records, somewhere between 2006 and 2010, Russia closed that strait to Polish commercial shipping entirely for roughly 4 straight years. No formal explanation was legally required. No international court could force it back open. Poland had no legal mechanism to compel access at all, because the water physically ran through Russian territory, and no treaty on earth obligated Moscow to share it. Now here's where the story gets genuinely painful, because there's a real city and real people who paid the price for that uncertainty for decades. Elbląg wasn't always some quiet backwater. According to historical records, this city was founded in 1237 by the Teutonic Knights, and it became one of the great trading powerhouses of the Hanseatic League, medieval Europe's most powerful free trade network, sitting in the exact same commercial league as Danzig, Lübeck, and Bruges. 700 years later, after 2 world wars, decades of communist rule, and then Russian control of its only sea exit, that same city had become a shadow of its former self. According to Poland's own statistical records, cargo tonnage moving through Elbląg's port collapsed from roughly 358,000 tons in 2014 down to just 125,000 tons by 2021, a fall of nearly 65% in under a decade. Shipping companies simply stopped bothering, quietly redirecting their routes to Polish ports that never required Russia's written permission at all. Places like Gdańsk, Gdynia, and Szczecin. An entire regional economy and a city with 785 years of trading history, slowly strangled by a border drawn by people who are all long since dead. So by the time Poland finally decided to act, this wasn't some abstract diplomatic grievance. It was decades of a NATO member state watching its own economy get quietly throttled by a foreign power holding the only key to its own front door. And Poland's answer to that decades-long humiliation wasn't a formal protest or another round of formal complaints filed in Brussels. It was a physical cut through the earth itself, carved directly through the Polish end of that same sandy spit, roughly 10 kilometers north of Elbląg. This new canal runs approximately 1.3 kilometers in length, deliberately built at the Polish end of the spit, in territory Russia has absolutely no hand on whatsoever. A brand new gap cut exactly where Poland wanted it, instead of where geography and post-war politics had forced it decades earlier. Now here's the number that should genuinely stop you. According to reporting on the project's final cost, Poland spent somewhere around 2 billion Polish zloty, roughly $450 million US dollars, to build just 1.3 kilometers of canal. Break that down, and you're looking at over $340 million for every single kilometer, making this one of the most expensive canal projects per kilometer in modern European history. And now, the detail that will surprise you, because this wasn't some accounting oversight nobody caught in advance. Polish economists themselves openly calculated that this canal would probably never turn a real profit at all. According to public debate circulating in Poland at the time, one widely cited academic projection suggested it could take somewhere around 650 years for the canal to commercially pay back its own construction costs, based on realistic assumptions about how large a ship could actually fit through a waterway only 4 to 5 meters deep. And Poland's government heard that exact criticism in public and built the canal anyway. Here's why that decision actually makes complete sense once you understand what Poland was genuinely trying to buy. This was never framed as a business investment expecting a financial return. According to statements from Polish officials at the time, this was a sovereignty purchase, plain and simple. Poland wasn't asking whether this canal would eventually pay for itself in shipping fees and cargo revenue. Poland was asking a completely different question. Was it worth continuing to pay Russia indefinitely in political leverage and economic uncertainty just to move Polish boats through Polish water? Once you frame the actual question that way, the 650-year payback period stops being an embarrassing failure and starts looking like the cheapest insurance policy a country could possibly buy. Modern large container ships typically need somewhere around 14 meters of draft just to stay afloat. Poland's brand new canal handles vessels drawing at most 4 to 5 meters. On paper, that looks like a strange mismatch. A massive investment built for boats that barely qualify as serious commercial shipping by today's global standards. But that mismatch was never actually the point. Poland wasn't trying to compete with its own much larger ports at Gdańsk or Gdynia, which were already handling far bigger cargo volumes without any of these headaches. Poland was trying to permanently remove a single word from its relationship with a hostile neighboring power. That word was permission. For 30 years, Poland had to ask for it. After this canal opened, Poland never had to ask again, and no amount of money Russia could offer, no diplomatic pressure Moscow could apply, could ever put that word back into the relationship the way it used to exist. So, Poland spent nearly $500 million building something that, by every normal financial measure, will almost certainly never pay for itself. And they considered that price completely reasonable, which raises an obvious question worth asking next. If Poland was willing to spend that much money just to remove Russia's ability to say no, how exactly did Russia respond to watching its own leverage disappear in real time? The opening ceremony itself, held on the 17th of September 2022, was deliberately staged as a message aimed directly at Moscow, and Polish officials didn't hide that intention at all. According to reporting from Reuters and UPI on the ceremony, Polish President Andrzej Duda stood at the site and delivered a line that cut straight to the point. In his own words, "This was a great victory of Poland, a great victory of patriots, and a great victory for those who genuinely understand what sovereignty actually means." He went further, stating plainly that a country which understands its own history and its own importance simply cannot afford to remain a dependent state and cannot allow another nation to decide its most important strategic matters for it. The first vessel to actually cross through the new canal was nothing dramatic at all, just a small workboat, according to coverage of the event. But according to eyewitness accounts from the ceremony, the crowd gathered on shore cheered as though an actual war had just ended. Now, here's the part of this story that should genuinely make you laugh, because Russia's actual response to watching decades of leverage disappear never rose above the level of paperwork. According to analysis from the Jamestown Foundation, Russian officials and state media spent years arguing the canal would devastate the fragile ecosystem of the Vistula Spit, threatening protected bird species and disrupting migratory routes along the coast. Russia even floated the idea of creating its own national nature park on its own section of the Spit, territory it had shown essentially zero interest in protecting for decades beforehand, seemingly hoping that move might trigger enough bureaucratic environmental review under EU law to bury Poland's entire project in delay. It didn't work. The European Union conducted its own environmental review of the project and concluded it could proceed using standard mitigation measures. Russia's sudden national park proposal produced nothing legally binding at all. And then there's the detail that turns Russia's entire environmental campaign into something almost poetic. According to Polish environmental reporting on the project, all that excavated sand and soil removed to dig the canal, roughly 3.4 million cubic meters of it, got deposited into the Baltic Sea right beside the new canal entrance. Over time, that material formed a brand new artificial island. And according to that same reporting, coastal bird species, some of the exact same species Russian state media had claimed would be driven toward extinction by this construction, apparently moved onto that new island almost immediately and began nesting there. A country holding roughly 6,000 nuclear warheads spent years warning the world about an ecological catastrophe, and the actual result was a brand new bird sanctuary, built entirely by accident. Poland's response to every single one of Russia's objections, the environmental warnings, the economic ridicule, the military security claims, was remarkably consistent. Silence, followed immediately by continued construction, right on schedule. So think about what that actually reveals. A nation holding one of the largest nuclear arsenals on the entire planet couldn't physically stop a canal, couldn't legally block it through international environmental law, and couldn't even make a coherent military argument against it that survived basic scrutiny about water depth. Russia's supposedly formidable leverage over this exact stretch of coastline turned out to depend entirely on Poland, simply accepting that leverage as a permanent, unchangeable fact of geography. But Poland wasn't the only country running this exact playbook, and once you start looking at the pattern across Europe, it becomes impossible to ignore. Before we widen this out across the rest of Europe, if stories like this one are the kind of analysis you want more of, take a second to subscribe. We dig into the stories that rarely make the headlines, using verified sources to separate fact from speculation. Germany ran the most dramatic version of this escape. According to energy data from the International Energy Agency, Berlin had spent roughly 2 decades building its entire national energy strategy around Russian gas, reaching close to 55% dependency on Russian supply at its absolute peak in 2021. The logic German officials used to justify that dependency sounded reasonable at the time. The idea that deep trade ties with Russia would naturally moderate Moscow's behavior over time. After February 2022, that theory collapsed completely, and Germany suddenly needed to replace an enormous share of its own energy supply immediately. Here's the number that should genuinely surprise you. Berlin constructed 4 separate floating LNG terminals at Wilhelmshaven, Brunsbüttel, Lubmin, and Deutsche Regas within roughly 12 months. Infrastructure projects of that scale normally require somewhere between 5 and 7 years of planning and construction. Germany did it in a single year, under emergency conditions, bypassing normal regulatory timelines entirely. By 2024, Russian gas made up less than 5% of Germany's total supply, down from that peak of 55% in barely 3 years. Ukraine broke a nearly identical form of Russian leverage in a completely different way, not through construction, but through drones. Russia had controlled the Kerch Strait, the only waterway connecting the Black Sea to the Sea of Azov, for years. In November 2018, Russian Coast Guard vessels rammed and seized 3 Ukrainian naval ships attempting to pass through that exact strait, holding 24 Ukrainian sailors in custody for months afterward. Ukraine couldn't fight its way through that choke point using conventional naval force. So instead, Ukrainian maritime drone units began systematically targeting Russian Black Sea fleet vessels and infrastructure directly. The Crimean Bridge, Russia's own showpiece symbol of control over that strait, was struck by a truck bomb in October 2022 and hit again by Ukrainian missiles in July 2023. By mid-2024, Russia had effectively pulled most of its Black Sea fleet back to ports much farther east, specifically to escape Ukrainian drone range. Hear that carefully, because it reveals something important. Ukraine didn't break Russia's grip on that strait by building an alternative route around it the way Poland did. Ukraine simply made the water itself too dangerous for Russian ships to use safely. Same result, completely different method. And then there's Finland and Sweden, arguably the most historically shocking escape of all. According to NATO's own accession records, Finland had maintained strict military neutrality for 75 years since the end of the Second World War. Sweden had maintained that same neutral status for over 200 years. Their neutrality functioned as a form of Russian leverage over the entire Baltic region, because as long as those two countries stayed outside NATO, the alliance never fully surrounded that sea. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine eliminated the entire political justification for that neutrality within months. Finland formally joined NATO on the 4th of April 2023. Sweden followed on the 7th of March 2024. For the first time in history, the Baltic Sea became a body of water completely ringed by NATO member states. Notice what every single one of these escapes actually has in common. Poland's canal took over 2 decades from initial advocacy to opening day. Germany's LNG independence took 3 years of genuinely emergency speed construction. Finland and Sweden's NATO membership required overturning generations, in Sweden's case centuries, of deeply held neutrality doctrine. None of it happened quickly. None of it was cheap. But every single one of them actually happened. That pattern raises an uncomfortable question for Russia specifically. If neighbor after neighbor keeps finding a way to escape this exact kind of geographic dependency, no matter how expensive or how slow the process actually is, what does Russia actually have left once that particular form of leverage stops working? Controlling a strait, a pipeline, or a transit corridor was, without question, Russia's most effective non-military tool. It was completely legal under international norms, since no country can be sanctioned simply for controlling its own territory. It was economically damaging to whichever neighbor depended on it. And critically, it never required a single soldier or a single missile, which meant it could never trigger a formal NATO military response. It was, in every practical sense, the perfect covert weapon. You don't need an army, you just need a locked gate and a rubber stamp. Once that gate started getting bypassed everywhere at once, Poland's canal, Germany's LNG terminals, Ukraine's drone campaign, Finland and Sweden's NATO accession, Russia's documented response shifted towards something considerably more dangerous. According to Reuters reporting, in November 2023, an undersea pipeline called the Baltic Connector, running between Finland and Estonia, was found severed on the seabed alongside a nearby data cable. Investigations reportedly concluded the damage was caused deliberately, tracing back to a vessel dragging its anchor across the pipeline route. Then, according to Finnish broadcaster YLE, in December 2024, an undersea power cable known as Estlink 2, one of the main electricity connections linking Finland and Estonia, was severed as well, cutting roughly 25% of Estonia's total electricity import capacity in a single incident. More recently, according to reports that remain harder to independently verify in full, the European Union has reportedly attributed a separate cyber attack targeting Poland's national power grid, one capable of cutting electricity to roughly 500,000 people, directly to Russia's own FSB intelligence service. And Baltic officials have reportedly issued warnings about planned sabotage operations aimed specifically at the infrastructure connecting Baltic power grids to the wider European network, the exact same kind of infrastructure these countries spent years building specifically to escape dependency on Russia's old Soviet-era grid. Notice the pattern hiding inside that shift. Geographic leverage was legal, deniable, and completely bloodless. Cutting undersea cables and sabotaging power grids is the opposite on every single dimension. It's illegal under international law. It's increasingly traceable back to its source. And it risks triggering exactly the kind of formal alliance response Russia spent decades carefully avoiding. Russia is trading its best, safest tool for one of its worst and most dangerous ones. A 2016 RAND Corporation study concluded Russian forces could reach the outskirts of major Baltic capitals within roughly 60 hours under the conditions of that era. And while NATO's military buildup since 2022 has changed a great deal, the underlying geography hasn't moved an inch. So the military threat is real, and it hasn't diminished by a single missile launcher. But here's the exact thing that Canal actually destroyed, and it deserves to be stated with total precision rather than exaggeration. For 30 straight years, a sovereign member of NATO and the European Union had to beg a hostile foreign power, in writing, for permission just to move its own ships through its own enclosed waters. That specific weapon, the kind that needs no soldiers, no missiles, nothing but quiet control over a single physical chokepoint, is now dead, permanently. The canal cannot be unbuilt. The independence it created cannot be clawed back by Moscow, no matter how much pressure the Kremlin decides to throw at it next. And that's the verdict sitting underneath this entire story, the one that should genuinely unsettle Moscow. Russia's geographic leverage was never actually about geography at all. It was about one single question, whether its neighbors were willing to keep accepting dependency as a permanent, unchangeable fact of life, like gravity. The instant one country refused to accept that, the instant Poland chose to spend nearly $500 million proving an exit could genuinely be carved out of the earth itself, that entire weapon evaporated completely without a single Iskander missile ever having to move an inch. Russia still has its weapons. What it no longer has, at least in this one corner of Europe, is the silent, legal, completely deniable kind of power that ruled for 30 straight years without ever firing a single shot. But that same silent grip isn't just slipping along Russia's borders. It's collapsing inside Russia's own economy too, and it's happening to the exact people who once believed themselves completely untouchable. We exposed exactly that in our last video. The men who built Russia's greatest fortunes under one unspoken deal with Putin himself. Stay loyal, stay silent, and your empire stays yours. One of them obeyed every single rule for 25 straight years and still watched his entire empire vanish in a single morning. If this story is about a foreign power losing its grip on a neighbor it once controlled without firing a shot, that video is about Putin doing the exact same thing to his own billionaires from the inside. And it's one of the most revealing stories we've ever put together about what's actually happening behind the Kremlin's walls right now. It's on your screen. Watch it next. This is the Frontline show, and this war is moving faster than almost anyone is prepared for. We'll see you in the next one.